And now, the violent economies continuation with King Thomas. King Thomas is yes. Nossa, ela é muita coisa. Political law from University of Cape Town, and what? Yes. Okay. Global Initiative Against Transterritorial Organized Crime. I'm joking with King. Organized crime is state. And my friend Javier Perez is Salvadorian American, PhD candidate at the University of Cape Town. Os dois são de Cape Town. His research looked at the intersections of race, critical prison studies, gangs, and performing arts. He is also published poet and active organizer in the performing arts industry in Cape Town. Yes, that's all.
Hi, good afternoon everyone. Can you hear me all right? Okay, great. So I know this is the last session and you're probably all a bit tired, but I hope that I can keep your attention going for the next 20 minutes. As I said, my name is Kim Thomas. I'm an analyst at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Just a brief overview of the work that we do. So the Global Initiative is an independent civil society organization that was founded in 2013. And we have offices in Geneva, Vienna, Malta, and Cape Town. Our objectives are basically to analyze and publish information on organized crime, to grow our network of experts, to promote engagements, debates, discussions on effective policy responses, and then lastly, and also very importantly, to develop and implement innovative field-based pilot sort of responses to organized crime. So although the Global Initiative covers a wide variety of organized crime globally, in South Africa we have a focus on 4 projects at the moment. The first one is the ENACT project, which looks at enhancing Africa's response to organized crime, so that looks at the whole continent, and we're currently developing an index on measuring organized crime in Africa. That's in partnership with the Institute for Security Studies, which is also in Pretoria. The other project is our Assassination Witness project, which monitors and analyzes assassinations in South Africa, which you would have heard about already in this conference, as they're quite common, and we're trying to actually put a number to those assassinations. Then we are running a gang monitor, which is what I'll speak on a bit more today. And then lastly, we also have a resilience fund where we both support and track and try and understand resilient responses in the context of organized crime. So just a bit of background for those of you that don't know. I'm sure the South Africans are very aware that there's been a lot of discussion in the media of the current army presence in Cape Town. There's been quite a drastic increase in violence, and particularly gang violence. Even with the intervention of the military, which came on 18th of July this year, they're still averaging about 40 murders per weekend, so very high rates of violence. And there hasn't been a decrease, although there's been some reporting on the successes of the operations having the military, nothing concrete yet. There's also in recent years, but also recent months, been an increase in protests and community disapproval of gangs and gang-related violence across the 3 cities that we have been looking at, which are Johannesburg, Nelson Mandela Bay, for those of you who don't know, that's on the east coast of South Africa, and then Cape Town. And at one point last year in October, there were marches, community marches across all 3 cities at the same time, basically just saying they've had enough of gang violence. And so, yeah, at the moment there are also special gang operations by the state, some with more information than others on what they're actually doing in these cities. So our gang monitor is trying to basically answer a few key questions. And I think the overarching question that we're trying to sort of address is, what are the longer term patterns of change or evolution of gangsterism in South Africa? Then how do communities respond to gangsterism? What are the emerging connections between cities? And then what are the commonalities or unique characteristics of these gangs in the different cities? Our methodology includes extensive interviews with community members, gang leaders, various members of the state, the police, local government. We really try and ask a variety of people across the board about the impact and their understanding of what gangs are doing and the markets in which they're operating in. We also regularly follow the media on gang violence and violence in general, also through our assassinations monitor, to try and keep tab of when there's flares of violence in particular places and, if possible, what they're relating to. We then review secondary material, and our quite ambitious project, part of the Gang Monitor, is attempting to map gang territory to monitor the evolution and the change of gangs and where they're moving and how they're moving. And I'll talk a bit more about that. Basically, this builds on our earlier work, but it's a project that only started in July last year, so we're still in quite early phases considering what we want to do. Is a team of 4 people, and we try to connect this to our global work on organized crime. Before I think we can sort of get more into understanding all these different things that we're trying to track in terms of evolution and dynamics, it's important to have a bit of context. And so in our research, we've created this little diagram to show what we call the political economy of gangs in South Africa, and showing basically the relationship between violence, the drug market, and territory, and basically how these can all be exchanged for each other and impact on each other, and in general on the gang lifestyle. So as it's very common, violence is helping you to get your territory. Territory helps you gain money through extortion or being able to have the turf to sell your drugs for your drug market. Drug market also brings in money, which is then exchanged for weapons, violence, and sort of the cycle and relationships continue. Another thing that we think is quite valuable to take note with regard to the current state of violence in South Africa is that it shouldn't be seen out of the context of what's sort of causing this violence. And different scholars or different activists will often point out one particular cause, but we think it's important to understand it as a combination of factors. So you have your global factors, which is the increase in drug production, which we're seeing across our research globally, and particularly in South Africa, and coming down the East African coast, there's been an increase in heroin trafficking and heroin use and sales in South Africa. Then we also have to look at the national factors, which include the breakdown of policing, corruption, and increased access to firearms. And then, of course, what often does get discussed are our local factors of social and economic exclusion and the environments in which a lot of the communities that have gang problems find themselves in. So one of the ways that we have tried to track the evolution of gangs, or we will continue to try as we're still in our beginning phases, is to try and map gang territory. So this map is unfortunately it's part of our preliminary findings from our pilot. So by the end of the year, we're hoping to publish our final map from our first range. But this is more illustrative of what we're trying to do. And so you can see that there's different colors. Different colors are for different gangs. These are, I think we picked the top 6 or the top 8 gangs just to map here. And in some areas which are darker than others, it's because there's more overlap, so there's more variety of gangs that are dominant in that area. What's important to note, though, is that from our gang mapping research, we have done extensive interviews where our field researchers have gone out and asked about who's present in what area. And there's been quite a criteria to sort of whether or not to count a gang, and we've come up with 93 different gangs in Cape Town. So that's a lot for not a very big city. And the more gangs that you have in one specific area, from our research and looking at murders and attempted murder statistics, seems to show that that also results in more violence. As we plan to over time is to then remap and to see what has changed in terms of which gangs have the strongest presence in each particular place, and to see if that's relating to any particular power dynamics that we know of. So what we do know already from partly the motivation for wanting to map gangs, but also what we've learned in the process of mapping gangs, and kind of what's important in terms of space and why geography matters. So occupational control by gangs is key for a number of reasons. One is the economy. Turf provides a space to store and sell your drugs and your weapons. It's also an opportunity for extortion, which we can get into more detail later in the questions if you want to know the various types of extortion. And then also identity. Gang members very commonly in interviews will root their conversations in geography and in sort of having sort of a sense of ownership over a specific space. And with that also then comes power, and the wide control of the turf is a way to signify that your gang and you have a sense of power and status. As we map them over time, we want to see that the change of ownership marks a shift in power, and then also whether or not there's consolidation, and then also if there's multiple sort of ownerships in one area, if there's a fragmentation of gangs, and then obviously if there's a reduction in general turf by gangs, it's a key indicator of success. So also with trying to answer these questions and trying to look at and understand the relationship between gangs and their communities, we notice, although it's obviously a lot more nuanced than two separate groups, but there's generally the situation where gangs are embedding themselves more firmly in the community and the community is accepting their presence. And then on the other hand, you have this sense of resilience against gangs and their crimes. So with community embedding, as I've mentioned, community relationships are very key for gangs to gain and maintain their territory and their turf. If they have relationships with the community is not going to necessarily want someone else to come in and take that space because they know the people that are currently in that space. They also create for themselves a Robin Hood image. This comes up a lot in our research and interviews, and those that are sort of recipients of it will be quite blunt to know what's happening, but just don't have really much option otherwise. So the payment for rent to prevent evictions, the payment of school fees, food and other services. A lot of the areas where there's a strong gang presence, there's just a lack of social services in general, and if the gang can provide those social services, you're going to take them because you've got no other option. As a result, community members often get indebted to these gangs, and sometimes it's voluntary in sense of allegiance. This gang has helped me, I'm happy to help. Sometimes it's by force, they don't really have a choice now. We often see how they sort of pay back the gangs is by storing guns or drugs, providing a lookout for police. That was actually quite common from our interviews with pensioners who are always at home and don't have much opportunity for income, and maybe their children can't help support them, and so the gangs will bring them food and they just got to look out for when the police are coming and give them a warning through a WhatsApp message. And then obviously the ability to buy off witnesses when they've witnessed crime, because crime is often very out in the open and people know who the perpetrators are, but then if you've received a favor from this gang, then you're not going to be a witness. And then, as they form a particular relationship with one gang, then it's very unlikely that they're going to be open to another gang being there unless it's through violent force that they've moved in. On the other side, we are also noticing sort of a more recent uprising that I mentioned of community resilience against gangs, a sense of we've had enough of this violence, we've had enough of losing our sons and daughters, we just don't want this anymore. And this has resulted in a lot of protests, but also quite interesting to note is that this has been quite women-led, and so it's mothers that have just had enough. And we've worked with quite a few of these different groups and activists in Cape Town, and one of their key things that they keep saying, and they say in their marches as well, is that we want peaceful protests, we want a peaceful response because we're just tired of the violence, we don't want more violence. Also, just as we started documenting community resilience, we thought it would be good to just look at it in the context of community resilience against gangs over the past 2 decades. So those that are familiar with South African context will know about the Pagad. Although they're still present, they were much more strongly present in the 90s and early 2000s, but they shifted to become a bit violent themselves and also allegedly involved in various aspects of the drug trade, and sort of lost a sense of legitimacy in the communities in which they were in. We then saw a resurgence of gang control, huge influx of drugs in the sort of, new democracy, new markets, opening of all of that brought with it its problems as well, and sort of gangs had new leadership and just wider connections and more targeted violence. And as I mentioned earlier, this sort of recent bubbling and just had enough. Some of the strategic things that some community groups have done is they've actually physically blocked roads where they know that drugs or something will come in, and just said, enough, if we protest in the street, then the police come out, and if the police are out, then you're not going to be doing your business. So a very sort of practical response there. And generally quite a negative view of what the state is doing, but I'll get a bit more into that. So also what we have, this is obviously the preliminary findings of all of our research across the cities, and we've noticed some commonalities across these cities. One is that there's been an increase in the murder rate in the areas that we're looking in for 2013-2014. In Cape Town, we're looking at a bigger geographic area, purely because we're based there and we have more researchers there. For Johannesburg, we focused on Westbury, and for Nelson Mandela Bay, we focused on Helenvale. So that's our findings are based on those areas. For Cape Town, it was the whole of the city of Cape Town. The increase in firearms, that there are more guns and that they have destabilized gang control and hierarchy. If a lower level gang member has now got access to a firearm, he feels a lot more empowered, and the power dynamics can change, and that can lead to the splintering or fragmentation of gangs. So the other thing that we're noticing is both the consolidation and fragmentation or splintering of gangs at the same time. So on the one hand, we have our bigger gangs that are slowly getting more geographic control and growth and becoming more established, but at the same time, we have in other areas a lot of splintering, so they break away little gangs. But what we find with our smaller gangs, although they don't want to necessarily be under the leadership or authority of the big gangs, they still are aligned to them because they rely on them for access, because they don't have their own access to international drug markets or weapons, for example. So they're usually aligned to either an established street gang, or sometimes they're directly aligned to the prison number gangs. I'm not going to go into the difference between those gangs in South Africa, but you can ask me questions later if you like. And so the mapping that we're doing is to try and understand in all these cities how the gangs are consolidating and fragmenting at the same time, and what that means for violence and the sort of the gang business. But something consistent across all three cities is just high levels of police corruption, particularly, there's some at the high level, but also just being able to, pay off so that your docket is lost, or that evidence is tampered with, or just there's a common sort of, everyone just says, always in the pockets. So a gang member will say to you in an interview, they're in our pockets. A community member will say, it's just accepted. It's quite sad in a lot of cases if you speak to activists or just community members that there's no point in going to the police a lot of the time because they don't see any sense of... So then just some unique characteristics and key findings by the cities. For Johannesburg, so Johannesburg is the one city where we have already published our report, so if you're interested you can find it on our website. We noticed that there are very clear cycles of violence and community response, and we're looking since the beginning of South Africa's democracy, and we note that, increase in violence, uproar community response, police response, then sort of like a die down, and you can actually quite clearly see the cycles, but it doesn't seem to break, just sort of a die down and then it comes back. That there's currently a new wave of gang leaders. They rely on the old names and ideology and mythology and sort of gang culture of the older gangs, but they're not actually operating in the same way that they did, but they kind of more use that for a recruitment mechanism. And quite interestingly, they're known now as more, even though we do know who most of the gang leaders are, but they have what's called more of a faceless presence, so they're not as out there proudly as they might have been previously. Although there have been recent arrests, so that's a little less so the case now. And then there's a strong link, although like with all of these findings, we see this across these cities. It's just these findings are particularly evident in those particular cities, but a strong link with gangs and the taxi industry and the use of taxis as a sort of money cleaning business, and how in a particular taxi association they really just took over the whole association for their business. Where in Cape Town there's more of a collaboration as opposed to a takeover. And then quite interestingly, with regard to connections between cities, that it's quite frequent for gangs in Johannesburg to then outsource their violence to gangs that they have a relationship in Cape Town, but this is more particularly for targeted hits of, more influential gang members or opposition or someone in particular, as opposed to more general violence. In Cape Town, there's been a drastic increase in gun violence. We've seen that in the mortuary data, and we can quite clearly pin it in terms of time to what some South Africans might have heard of, the Prinsloo case, which is where a corrupt South African policeman who was in charge of the Central Firearms Registry, instead of destroying guns, just sold them to the gangsters in Cape Town. So it was over 2,000 guns that are on record in the court papers, and you can really see how they trickled their way and their impact in Cape Town. And then also that the gangs have quite a strong presence in the CBD, in the nightclub security industry, but also amongst bouncers and restaurants and really quarters of where the tourist areas are that people are quite unaware are actually also controlled by these gangs. Then lastly, for Nelson Mandela Bay, we see less community resilience there and a stronger embedding of the gangs there and less of a sense of hope to overcome it. And then also quite a strong connection between government and tenders and gangs in Nelson Mandela Bay, and how sort of alleged gang leaders have registered their small businesses to get tenders and kind of wiggle their way into that process as gang members. But I will stop on that. Thank you.
There, I came to become familiar with the gangs in Cape Town, and I had an intuition that there's something connected, that there's a commonality, shared story, and I think that there's no coincidence that we see gangs in very specific places, not exclusively, but very much in places where you have a history of settler colonialism, slavery, racialization, the erasure of indigenous ancestry, et cetera, right? So you see it in the Philippines, Central America, the United States, Brazil, Colombia, South Africa, especially in the Cape. So this is a very exciting place to be, and my hope is that the paper and the research that I'm doing for my PhD and the paper that I'll present today is relevant to my colleagues who are also working in areas where there are gangs, and I would love to hear your thoughts. So let me begin. I'm just going to leave this up here. It's a poem, believe it or not. It is a poem by Douglas Kearney, and I'm just going to leave it up there and get back to it by the end of my presentation, and you'll see why. So just to begin, I'd like to read an excerpt from Mohammed Adhikari's 1992 article, The Sons of Ham, just to give a historical background and context for those who are not familiar. Quote, in South Africa, and especially in the Western Cape, Ham is used as a pejorative label for the colored laboring poor. The term alludes to the curse of Ham, which initially served as a popular justification for African slavery in Western society. This Hamitic myth has been part of South African racial discourse since the days of Dutch colonial rule, and as the contemporary use of the word Ham indicates, at a popular level, the supposed racial attributes of colored people are still partly ascribed to their servile past, end quote. And also for those who are not familiar, just want to give a background that the term colored is very different to its use in the United States and in the Americas. In South Africa, colored refers to a very particular racial group descended from a diverse ancestry of African and Asian slaves, Khoisan and European settlers. So as such, the classification is based on this notion of mixed ancestry, which is of course also problematic, as Dimitri Erasmus has shown, because it implies that there's such a thing as pure ancestry, which is false. But nevertheless, I try to work with this and also problematize this notion of colored with my work, and I rely heavily on Erasmus's use of creolization to think about it. Okay, so this paper takes as a point of departure the enduring legacy of this, of the curse of Ham in the biblical myth and how it was used to justify slavery in the Cape. It forms part of my broader doctoral research, which examines how colored identity remains relentlessly haunted by the specters of slavery and colonialism, specifically as a hyper-incarcerated group in an era of global racialized mass incarceration. I say mass incarceration because that's how most people know it, but I think the more technical, better term is hyper-incarceration. Colored men are imprisoned at 12 times the rate of white men and double the rate of black, i.e. non-colored men. The lingering resonances of slave and colonial history can be heard echoing within the term Ham, which alludes to the curse of Ham. To be Ham is, more background. The biblical tell, the curse of Ham is, so Noah cursed the descendants of his son Ham, who saw Noah naked and drunk. As a result, Ham's damned lineage would forever be servants to Noah's other sons. The biblical myth was used as justification within the colonial imaginary to frame the enslaved body as deserving of servitude and as being Ham's cursed children. Okay? So in the Cape, to be Ham is to carry particular stereotypes associated with working class colored townships on the Cape Flats, especially those physical traits and mannerisms that epitomize a racialized and classist depiction of what is supposedly uncivilized, undesirable, criminal, or of moral and cultural shortcomings. Ham's antithesis is sturdy, which similarly carries pejorative undertones as it denotes upper or middle class individuals, but more deeply insinuates someone who chooses to be an outsider to their own predominantly working class culture. Sturvey accuses privileged coloreds of trying to assimilate into a dominant white society that will never truly be accepting of being uppity, yet it also partly invokes a sense of shame, as a dual reminder of one's coloredness and a running away or turning one's back from it and its associated Hamness. Together, Ham and Sturvey demarcate a binary of a racialized and classed imaginary in which colored identity navigates. They stand in tension with one another, a tension deeply rooted in processes of racialization and creolization first commenced in the colonial period. Specifically, I want to highlight an early rendition of this tension from the colonial era as represented by the dichotomy of the Trustus and the practice of arming trusted Khoi in the commandos. So these two things. So the Trustus is a 19th century term or 18th century term for runaway slaves and runaway Khoi. And the commandos were a semi-formal, semi-informal policing system created during the colony, which was also partly used to capture runaway slaves. Right? And it's interesting that you see with the commandos the use of Khoi and also some use of trusted slaves to catch runaway slaves and runaway Khoi. This early episode foreshadows the discursive and embodied tensions that continue to exist between Ham and the Sturvey. As such, it is deeply rooted in colonial constructs framed by a language of selfhood and individual agency, implicating the individual with the alleged crime of being too Ham or being too Sturvey. That is, Ham is used to justify the differentiation between the supposedly respectable colored citizen and the rest, who are in turn deserving of a stigmatizing discourse that then materializes in the disproportionate imprisonment, crime, and gang rates that we see today. I refer to this current usage of the term Ham within and against colored communities as a prime example of the insidious ways that racialized constructions of coloredness as criminal and disposable has allowed the past to continue to exist in the present. So I rely on Jacques Derrida's concept of hauntology, which is a homonym for ontology. And basically it means that the past is haunting the present. It undoes the Western ontological duality of presence and absence, bringing into the frame the unobservable and the fact that the past is in fact in the present, in both observable and invisible ways. This concept allows us to think about history beyond linear models, where the past is something that happened and now we're here, and we have to study things in a linear way. But in reality, we can think about the past as having a very real presence today. Okay? So I kind of depart from Derrida's use of hauntology and build on Kashif Pau's use of hauntology, where he places focus on the body and the bodily performativities. To quote his work, "This is a story about bodies that burn with the sensations of absence and memory, life and death, learning the nature of haunting by being themselves haunted," end quote. So using this theory of hauntology and Kashif Pau's use of hauntology, which is a very embodied approach, allows for a theorization of coloredness as embodied memory work, as relentlessly haunted by the imaginative and discursive continuities of racialized enclosure that was initiated by slavery and colonialism. The Hamitic myth, then, arises as a pervasive spectre, as a ghost, not only because of the underlying connotations that allude to slavery, but also because the Cape has been deeply invested in the project of amnesia, with a deep sense of shame attached to any acknowledgement of slave or Khoi ancestry, partly sustained by the strategic omission of slave voices in the archives, just as Saidiya Hartman has called the archives a mortuary. In the Cape, it's even more so. Slave voices and memory have been systematically silenced, yet the call to remember reverberates within the contested and complex relations that colored communities have with the term Ham itself. So the specter of Ham haunts colored identity in particular ways. And with that, I argue that the colored gangster is a performative embodiment of the Trustus, or as Nigel Penn, the historian, aptly called them, Droster gangs. So I think about the Drosters as the first gangs in the Cape. And since gangsterism is alive and thriving in the community where that is the direct descendants of slave and boy, I think there's an interesting connection to be explored here. Whereas the Drosters took to the mountains to evade oppression and form alternative modalities of being, the gangsters of today journey to prisons, where, as many scholars have looked at and have explored, they also construct alternative belongings, construct complex identities, and engage in mythologies and very interesting opaque structures. And here I engage with Edward Glissant's concept of opacity, but I won't, for the sake of time, I won't go into that too much. So if the racial discourse pushed by the Hamitic mythology continues to have a spectral presence in Cape Town, then contemporary gangsterism should be understood in that vein, as an embodiment of Maronage, of the Drosters, of a drive to flight that was always inhabited. To give you a little bit of more of a historical background, slave resistance at the Cape was not one based on class consciousness. There was no revolutionary vision of abolition, and there's a lot of reasons for that, which I won't go into. Suffice it to say that the more popular form of resistance was running away, was drosting. The Droster gangs lived precarious lives, living outside the colony, but always dependent on it and surrounding farms. So they forged themselves as figures within the imaginary of both colonizers and colonized by forming temporary, and only in one case, a long-term community hidden in the mountains, living off of stolen livestock and stolen ammunition and things like that. The Drosters, the white ruling oligarchy feared the threat that the Drosters posed to the colonial order, increasingly turning to private punishment of captured runaways toward public chastisement and heightened nightly patrol. But the company was not equipped to go after the Drosters, so they formed a commando system. And the commando system was armed and mounted militias of mobilized men that were formed by farmers and free burghers. And interestingly, the commando military tactics were characteristically influenced by Khoi strategies, which implies that the system was never exclusively white, but rather involved the presence of indigenous allies against other indigenous groups. The recapturing of runaway slaves was commonly done with the aid and participation of poet and slaves. So, during slavery, slave and indigenous bodies were objectified as the antithesis to the citizen human embodied by the European. Today, the former's direct descendants figure as the antithesis to the respectable citizenry. The slave's bondage was justified by the perceived lack they embodied. Likewise, the hyper-incarceration of colored men is condoned until their communities, quote-unquote, reform themselves. While the ghost of slavery continues to haunt our imaginaries through the continuities of racialized discourses imprinted on colored bodies, the contemporary gang carries the ghost of Trustus through its continued insistence on opaque structures and alternative modalities of being. Insofar as coloredness remains ontologically positioned as the incarnation of absence, lackness, void, or relative void at least, evidenced in the mythology surrounding the term Ham, the modern gang on the Cape Flat then figures as the performative embodiment of the spectral maroon, or the droste. Not only in oppositional relation to power and authority and the state, but also to the coercive conditions of assimilation and acceptance, which is embodied by the sturdy. So, for my project, and I want to end on a practical element to my PhD research. The emphasis lies on the new meanings embodied repertoires of modern colored gangsters might behold through critical engagements with this history. Central to the practice of embodied memory work and self-authorship is, I argue, a poetics of engaging with the spectre. I take lead from Mark Fleshman, a theater maker and lecturer at UCT, who proposes that performance can make the archive speak in unspeakable ways. He created a stage performance that he facilitated using a body-centered approach that catalyzes inventories of household items of people who died during the colonial period. So he took household items of a bunch of people from the archives. He took his performers to historical sites. He took collected materials and different histories and created a kind of forensic archaeology that the body would perform in interaction with the fragments, with the hope of allowing the haunted fragments to reveal meaning rather than for us to interpret meaning and pin it onto the fragments, which is something we tend to do as researchers. Fleshman frames this process through improvisation. So basically the process involves an exploration of the objects by silent listening, slowly allowing sound to emerge, and then, if possible, music is composed. Unfortunately, I didn't see this performance because it was before my time, but I take direction from Fleshman to argue that a methodology of haunted narratives requires a multidisciplinary framework, that it pays attention to the embodiment of haunting traumas, particularly as they are evoked through performative methods and poetic inquiry. So my project builds on Diana Taylor's formulation of the body as a site where communal memories, histories, and values are transmitted and animated through choreographies of meaning. I also build on the theorization of intergenerational trauma pushed by Gabrielle Schwab, who argues for the notion of a crypt to understand how people create psychic and linguistic enclaves in order to store the unspeakable traumas of violent histories, losses, and deaths that have been denied or refused. So even though in the Cape, slavery is extremely silenced, both within the community and systematically by any state institutions, government institutions, the idea is that there are traces of these silences and of these gaps within the language itself and within the body itself. Schwab explains that ghostly emergences of these encrypted traumas become visible and traceable through metaphor, puns, semantic ambiguities, homonyms, homophones, etc. In other words, we can tap into these silenced but stored histories through performance and poetry. Lisa Blackman further advocates for what she calls scenes of entanglements to visualize this haunted data by performatively staging and aligning a distributed and scattered array of fleeting fragments and traces. So my project proposes to use poetry and performance workshops with incarcerated and formerly incarcerated participants. Specifically, I argue the poetic style currently being established by Douglas Kearney, as you see before you, which he calls performative typography, opens key opportunities for this kind of work. So this style of poetry is influenced by graffiti, as well as hip-hop sonic aesthetics and production techniques, DJing, etc. Kearney's performative typography encompasses a powerful interplay of movement and voice, defying the traditional literary canon as and what we understand to be poetic form. And this form that he's pushing reimagines the possibilities of the page and the possibilities of poetry. This poem that I have here is titled Noah, Ham, Fathers of the Year. And I can let you experience it as you will, because as you can see, it's not like a regular poem that you would read top down, but it's something that you simply experience visually. But in this poem, the written text invokes both the visual as well as the musical and rhythmic, while blurring spatial elements and overlaying text on top of text on top of text. Alluding to the biblical tale of Ham, the text literally reads in a manner that gives the reader a sense of falling, as you can see when you read some of the words that are falling, violently even, as was the case of Ham's lineage that was cursed by Noah into perpetual servitude. The repetitive yet visually altering display of he that you see here is a pun for he, as in men, and an onomatopoeia for the drunken laughter, together forming a critique of the fragile relations among men, especially those between fathers and sons, as is also implied in the title of the piece. The physicality and musicality of the poem creates a disturbing yet provocative experience for the reader, who must figure their way through the mess that is the narrative itself, and what narrative isn't messy. For purposes of this study, I intend to build on Kearney's groundbreaking work using the kind of embodying, while also using the kind of embodiment exercises introduced by the example of Fleshman. So I wanted to end also on, I wanted to give you a sort of breakdown of the workshop that I'm going to be doing around this theme of Kham. But I started my new project with the new group last week only, and things are changing. Things are really like, I can't even give you that breakdown because I have to go back and do a lot of changes. You know, it's a very grounded approach. It's a very, it's a very grounded approach that I take. So sort of based on the group that I have, which is a brilliant group, we're working at the Slave Lodge Museum, the Ezekiel Slave Lodge Museum in Cape Town, doing workshops every Tuesdays and Thursdays for 2 hours. And it's around this history, it's around poetry, it's around performance. Basically, the aim is to produce this kind of poetry and to see what kind of narratives come out of engaging with the history in a very site-specific way, and engaging with the kind of mythology of the Trustus, and to sort of give new meanings to gangsterism and new critiques of the history of prisons. And I'll end there, and I'll be happy to answer. I know I gave a very broad overview of a very big and complex project, but I wanted to do that in order to get as much critical feedback as possible. So thank you very much.
Now open the questions.
May I? Well, congrats to you both. Very interesting presentations. I have two questions to you, Kim. In fact, actually two curiosities. The first one, I would like to hear more from you about the current deployment of the military in Cape Town. If you could develop more this recent information that's about it. And the second one is a methodological one. How is the work of interviewing gang members? If you can give me an example of this work, is it difficult? How do you do this kind of approach? How is the selection of people? more a methodological background of this kind of work, because it's very interesting, and I work also with interviewing techniques, and I would like to learn more from you.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentations. My question goes to the two panelists, Kim and brother Javier. This problem of gangsterism has been going on for a long time in this country. Like Kim mentioned, I remember in the mid-1990s in Cape Town there emerged a community grouping which was called Packard, which was sick and tired because of the drug trade and the violence. And I remember very well, there were two brothers who were attacked. One died there. I think it was Rashidi staff or something like that. Right. So it looks like this problem is going on and on and on. Right now, we just mentioned here that the government is actually at the end to move up troops to Cape Town to go and try to quell this violence. And then I think when the president was actually announcing this move, he actually said it was going to cost the South African taxpayers something like 30 or 24 million, something like that, which is a lot of money from this fast. Right. So could it be perhaps maybe there is some sort of influence from the Latin Americans there, like what was his name, this gangster, Mr. Pablo Escobar? You remember, is it from Brazil, I think? Was the big mafia there. I'm just a bit suspicious, maybe you help me. And the Kim, when you do this research, do you sometimes maybe interact with the authorities, our local authorities here, the government? Maybe to give them some advice to say, okay, in order to quell this problem, you remember in the 1900s or whatever, there was a man called Mr. Al Capone. Mr. Al Capone was a gang leader, you remember that? He is the one who popularized this theme of saying you must pay protection fee. So, in other words, he was running gangsters, all right? To the extent that at one stage he was a threat to the American government. He actually was like running the politicians, to the extent that the government said, no, let's stop this man with his gangsters. I think they formed an organization called CIA, which infiltrated the gangsters and eventually overthrew the gangsters. All right. So, just to cut the long story short, Kim, do you perhaps meet with the authorities and try to give them some advice? Because it's a threat. We may take it lightly, because now you see it's from Cape, Eastern Cape, a little bit in Johannesburg. So we don't know how this thing will end up. Thank you very much.
My more two questions and come back to Kim and Javier.
Thanks, Kim and Javier. My first question is related to Javier, and we had this conversation over lunch. In some ways you're pointing to the kind of historical continuities around race on the one hand, but you're also talking about the historical continuities around, in your instance you're talking about the Trustus, but of course this could also speak to the Namba gang, it could also speak to the Mangaloza, and this entire kind of lineage of what could be described as a kind of disruptive or transgressive modes of resistance. And I suppose I'm trying to figure out whether you are suggesting that gangs in the Western Cape at the moment are resistant and transgressive and disruptive. Because I'm not sure whether that kind of continuity exists in as clear a way. My sense is that there are other kinds of continuities where that disruption and that transgression exists in the kind of early 1900s, mid 1900s, late 1900s. You had all kinds of forms of kind of coloured intellectualism that came out of the Western Cape, that really informed much of the political movements that started to form the basis of the kind of liberation movement that we saw in South Africa. This was the Non-European Unity Movement, the Teachers League of South Africa. All of these groupings illustrated a different kind of transgression and disruption. And so I'm wanting you perhaps to just think a little bit about that and talk about that, because I'm not sure whether that kind of continuity exists. Yeah, the transgression of the Trustus to contemporary gangs in the Western Cape. And then maybe to Kim. I mean, Kim, again, thank you for your coverage. I thought that you were describing a number of kind of key ways of thinking about gangs, networks, and so on. But for me, what was perhaps missing, and maybe you can talk to this, is again a kind of historical analysis of gangs in the Western Cape. There's a whole anthropology of gangsterism in the Western Cape, of course, and how this intersects with a particular layer of masculinities. There are reasons why, for example, your levels of mortality and non-fatal injury that are related to interpersonal violence in the Western Cape have sharp objects implicated. Yeah? The knife is a big anthropological weapon. It's a tool that's particularly quite specific to the Western Cape. And so, I mean, this for me is a kind of texture that feels like it's missing from the analysis that you provided. So maybe you can talk to that. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm just going to respond firstly to Garth. So I think you bring up some very important points, and also I guess some questions that I face a lot in very sort of different ways whenever I present this. I try to avoid some things that I think I end up doing anyways. Firstly is I don't want to romanticize the gangs. That is not the point of my research or any sort of preconceived position of mine. So, for me, the sort of language that we have, like Garth used words like resistant, disruptive, a lot of the sort of language that we have has been inadequate for me, but at the same time, on the other hand, the kind of words that we normally use to talk about gangs is totally inadequate. Words that I've heard a lot over the past few days as well. Criminals. When we talk about prisons, inmates, prison. There's so many loaded words that I think are just inadequate to really capture the nuances and the complexities of what's going on, really, and the sort of deeper roots of gangs. I think part of the project of mine is trying to go beyond these words without also trying to also romance. So, one thing I mentioned to you Garth earlier was, I think in hindsight we can look at the Trusters and really be like, oh, those were the resistors, right? They were rebels, and we have this sort of understanding of that, in very particular ways. But at the time, I don't think that was the point even. It was just a sort of a modality of survival, a modality of being outside of the sort of racializations and violent means that the colony was doing, right? So I think we can sort of use that same sort of framework to think about the gangs today. It's not about, to me, it's not like the gangs are political necessarily. that can be up for debate, but that's not my argument or interest to sort of politicize the gangs, to think about them as resisting in the sort of traditional sense of it, but to think about, you know, what is their relation to this history of criminalization and racialization, which I think go hand in hand when it comes to the colored community in the Western Cape. There's always been a criminalizing effort to really imbue colored identity with these very negative stereotypes you see. So in that sense, I try to sort of think about the gangs in that relation. And I also don't want to, the other thing that I think, you know, I always have to remember to say, and I forgot today, is, you know, the sort of coloredness does not equal gangsterism. I know that's like a common thing that in the Western Cape especially, that's just like a stereotype that's there. And that's not at all, you know, that doesn't shake my research at all. I completely, you know, the kinds of colored intellectuals and radicalism that has existed, like you mentioned, Garth, and that continues to exist today, you know, you know, it's not my argument that gangsterism is the primary or main form of radicalism in the colored community. You know, completely not. You know, I just think that there is something else going on there that isn't necessarily confined to criminality, because it's a very specific history. You know, that you know the gangs emerged from. And with that said, I'll just very briefly say about Al Capone. You know, I think you know I think that's a very unique situation in the sense that I mean the sort of at the time the racialization of Italians was a very stereotypical one, but at the same time there was a way in which Italians and other European immigrants quickly became part of the larger white community, which is not possible for colored gangs or black gangs or brown gangs in Latin America, right? So it's a very different experience. So you don't see that sort of what you saw with Al Capone or with the mafia in the U.S. So I think it's very difficult to make connections between mafias and the type of gangs we see in the global South. I'll just stop there.
Well, thank you for your questions. I'm going to try and keep them brief, but I'm happy to chat a bit more detail afterwards. First, in response to the military, I'm not sure what more you want to know. The plan is that they be deployed for 3 months to assist the police, so to sort of provide a sense of security, so the police can do more raids, more arrests, some more investigation, I guess, open them up for capacity. The response since they've been there is that it hasn't really changed anything, and I think part of, I guess, what has been good from that is that when civil society was calling for the police, they're now acknowledging that's not really something they're going to call for as much anymore. The military. So I think there's definitely been a shift in the hope of what they can provide, and a general call to say, okay, we need to look at more problems. This isn't just a security, police, military problem, but let's look at more options. But yeah, I can answer some more questions later if you want on that. With regard to our experience for interviewing gang members, it's quite a sort of tricky thing. We obviously rely on relationships that we have built, which take time. And so I've been very fortunate to work with colleagues who've been working in the field longer than myself, who have already built established relationships with some of them will be ex-gang members and community leaders, or people that have sort of a sense of trust with gang members in the community or gang leaders. And so it's through these relationships of trust and essentially snowballing as we go that we build these relationships. And they know that the interviews are based on like anonymity, and that it's purely to understand what gang culture, the criminal markets that they're working in, and how things are changing and what the sort of power dynamics are. And so our interview questions are always quite vague in that sense. And it's also quite interesting how in an interview, you can know that the person you're interviewing is an active gang member, but when you ask questions, answers are always quite removed and in the third person, and it's always the story about this other person or this other situation or something from the past, when in reality that information could also just be their story from yesterday, but you take it as kind of a collective experience of the work that they're involved in, essentially. On the question with regard to do we engage with the state, do we do something? The answer is yes. So the Global Initiative's work is very much about promoting debate and engagement and also policy discussions. So our research aims to try and think of solutions of new ways to address these problems. And so with that, after we publish reports, we will then have state engagement at various levels in which we share our research findings and lay out suggestions on ways forward. When it comes to the question on more of a historical analysis, that is something that we have looked into, and in our reports we'll provide a bit of that. However, it's not as much a focus as our trying to analyze what's currently happening and to see how it's currently developing. However, it does still play into our research and our understanding, particularly when we're trying to understand more background. But with regard to looking specifically more at ideas of masculinity and things like that, that does fall a bit out of our research scope, as we're trying to understand this very much from an organized crime perspective more than anything else.
I just have a question for the first presenter. I just wanted to find out, in terms of the people who you said were protesting, who are usually women, are they protesting against the gang violence aspect of it, or are they totally opposed to having gangs in the community? Because it seems like in your presentation there's a degree of criminal levels that they're willing to accept. And I'm just thinking with like the Toti movie and how the African gangster is more the guy who commits crime in other places, like in the suburbs, and not in the actual community. So how are these, in the colored community, how do they actually look at that? And these gangsters are also selling drugs to our children. Are they okay with that? But if they're now shooting each other and a stray bullet hits my child, then now I have a problem.
Thank you, panelists, for a fascinating discussion. I'll go back to sort of structuralist Marxist analysis. I believe even in the age of 4IR, it's still very relevant. And I'd like to throw back to sort of the theoretical frameworks, uneven development, Wallerstein. We can then also look into, in my view, what is missing from this panel, and it's quite relevant, is that in the 90s with democratization, the emergence of the neoliberal state, the ANC government consciously chose a neoliberal path aligned to globalization. So the gear strategy, we need to look at the economic structural element and the causality with the rise of gangsterism, but in particular the super high pricing, monetization of drugs as a result of South Africa entering the global market. And I think that lacks. So I would look at two things, particularly in working class communities, with the GEAR project on 96, and when South Africa joined the WTO, overnight we reduced all the tariffs, particularly in textiles, leather components. Now these are areas or industries or manufacturing industries where large working class blue collar workers, particularly in the African and colored communities in the Western Cape, South Africa as a whole, worked. And overnight those industries were decimated. So the conscious policy of neoliberal policy of government, of the ANC government and all parties, chose a neoliberal path where we've had deindustrialization. So 100,000 textile jobs were disappeared overnight. Now if you were to include in your research methodology what were the job description of a lot of the gangsters and drug dealers, and you'll be surprised to find that a lot of them were artisans. that have worked in these industries that were decimated by the neoliberal path. So I think we need to broaden the research agenda to include a new sociology of work with job descriptions. And how do we reintegrate it? And currently I see no hope. The current economic path is fourth industrial revolution, big data, robotics. The Western Cape Economic Development Strategy is explicit that the Western Cape will be a services hub. That it's going to be around tourism, it's going to be around tech, it's going to be around hospitality. And that's clear. What happens to this layer, the working class layer, where all these violences and spatial patterns live cheek and jaw with the super rich? I mean, just one statistic I read the other day, that just the venture capital market in the Western Cape, more money is going into tech, startups, than into social housing. Now this is a conscious choice, allocation of capital. Where's the regulatory state? Where's state intervention? Where's the developmental state? I think these are critical questions researchers should be asking. And that's where the research agenda should be. I'm just being critical, but I think we've got to sort of pierce all these theoretical models and sort of just broaden the research agenda so we get some real solutions. Because research then needs to be presented as solutions to government and development funding institutions, etc.
Thanks.
A question to Kim. In your mapping, are you looking outside the metropole? Because certainly in Britain, London, they found the drug trade expanding out into the feeder towns. So there's a big market out there in the small towns. And what I'm interested to know is the violence there as well? Or is that territory less contested because one gang goes up this road into the other goes out the N1 or whatever, and so there is not the contestation. But also I think it would be really important to understand what is happening out there now, because the likelihood is in 10 years' time it'll be different. I mean, coming from a rural area in the Eastern Cape, the drugs are beginning to come into an area where there were no drugs, even 5 years ago. So it's really the question of the mapping and what you're mapping.
My question is on the archaeology. I wanted to ask, is the term harm you use in any way related to the term, like sort of like a group that's used to occupy the Southern Cape? Is it in any way related? And then I wanted to suggest there's a guy called William Black. He sort of took some calm guys. He took them from breakwater prison. There's like a lot of archives that has been like interviewing them, and I think that would be interesting to look at that because they were part of the things that were sort of established at the time.
Thanks a lot to the two presenters. Mine's a very quick one. It was just to ask, the part of the presentation that dealt with particular type of systemic violence that happens within where the case studies were drawn from. I want you to know, we're using a language, on this platform that, speaks to where people want to present from, but also I want you to know maybe from a more technical perspective, in categorizing people as, you say, gangsters and that kind of categorization. In diagnostics, there's also, you sort of try to have a clarity on this. So, what are the methodologies that you relied on in your working process that you could distinguish who was a gangster, who were citizens, and who were victims of crime? And I really ask this purely from a pedagogical point of view. So yeah, that's my one question in relation to the sort of language which is being used. That was a concern. Yeah, thanks.
Is it me? I don't know if you're pointing at me or directing traffic. Thanks. Look, just two quick questions. Kim, I know you didn't want to mention prison gangs at the moment, but which is fine. But can you just explain what role incarceration plays in gang culture? That would be really interesting. Especially as there is a sort of, seems to me, stunted popular narrative that prison produces thinkers and people who reject gangsterism, especially in the cinema. So that would be interesting to see what that does to actual gangs itself. And then to Javier, when you're unpacking with participants the history of the Trustus, what role does religion, if anything, play within that unfolding of self-realization? Thank you.
Okay, quickly. Somebody else. No. Yes. Okay, Kim. Your mapping. You know, I saw you have places like Holt Bay and Sea Pond, and you know, these are like really upmarket places. But when you kind of like, yeah. But when you kind of like, you know, watch the news or look at the presentation from the media, it's more like you kept flat and all those kind of areas that have a gang problem. You don't necessarily look at those places. You see. So I just wanted you to comment on that. Again, the second speaker, your approach seemed to be more like you embrace. Not that, maybe I may confuse you of embracing or maybe legitimizing the response of the gang to the society to some level. I may confuse to that, but even if you're not doing that, it seems to me, from how you presented it, like your approach, it seemed to be effective. It seemed to be really hitting at the core. Am I confused, or is it really, perhaps the best way to go in terms of addressing gangsterism? Do we really need to bring them closer to us and perhaps understand them more than, using jails and other forms of really keeping them away from the society? Thank you.
The last question, okay?
Yeah,
And then finish.
Okay, thank you. I've got two questions, but they're related, and I think and really maybe to get your comments rather than like answers to the questions. The first is that if I listen to Kim's presentation and she talked about the responses from the community, I would identify that there's three. The one is, that they're welcome because the gangs play a Robin Hood role. The second one, not unrelated, is that they're indebted, and therefore there's an element of collusion between the community and gangsterism. And then the third response is a response which we call a resistance and fight back. But yet, what is it that generates those different kinds of responses? And if earlier on you said to the gentleman here that, well, the army's not the solution, there must be other solutions. And the solution then has to come from the community themselves. So how do we, so instead of looking at the gangsters as the problem, how do we look at the community as the problem? And, in terms of solving the problem. That comes to Javier. What I understand with your methodology is that you're looking at how the past is haunting the present and so on, and your focus and your study is on gangsters either incarcerated or already being incarcerated. Now, what is it that makes part of the same community who are all haunted by the past have some gangsters, and what makes others not become gangsters? And then my last point also, Victor Munich talked about there's a lot of things which are invisible. And we as South Africans, we make a big fuss about colours being gangsters. And I think even your work, I think, is all the three communities are coloured communities. But I'm fairly sure that there are gangs with a similar past impacting on the present and you know, the same phenomena probably happens in white and African and to even extent other communities. And yet somehow that's invisible in our work and colours are labelled with the gangsters. You know, that's my comments.
Okay, 1 hour.
Okay. That's a lot of questions, and I'm going to try and get through them all. Okay. On the first question, which asked about protests against violence and kind of are they protesting just against the violence or against the gangs as a whole, and what are they okay with and what aren't they okay with? I would say it's not that simple, obviously, and so the biggest problem is with the violence, because with violence, those that aren't involved or even choose to be not involved in any way with gangsters can still be caught in crossfire. And there's a lot of what one might, for lack of a better word, innocent victims, you know, that are in the way and can get caught in crossfire. And so I think there's a general outcry, especially there's quite a lot of children that just get caught in crossfire, and that's what probably evokes most of the anger. And like I said, you know, mothers who have lost their children because they were walking home from school and then gang members were shooting at each other and their children got in the way. However, we also noticed that there is also disapproval of the gangs because of how they bring in drugs into the schools. And so it's not just the violence, but the sense that I send my child to school and I can sort of teach him everything I want at home, but then he's in an environment where they're just pushing drugs in the classroom, and it makes it a much more difficult environment. So they're frustrated also with the fact that then their children get addicted to certain substances and just the lack of potential for their future and opportunity. So it is a bit of both, to answer that question. Then the other question, when you said, you know, looking at the opening of markets and globalization and the change in how so many people did lose their jobs at that time, and at the same time we were able to bring in drugs, and it all just happened whilst we were trying to figure out a new democracy. And so some of our older research does look into that a bit. I will admit that the current scope of the research project doesn't look at kind of the impact of that to that degree. But I think your question on what were exactly the job descriptions of particular people who are now involved in gangsterism, or potentially their parents, and what was the impact of the closing of those, you know, textile factories and so on, would be a good thing for us to look into. So I'll definitely take note of that. Thank you. Then the question on mapping and looking outside of the metro. So the short answer is no, we haven't looked outside of the city, just because that was a mammoth task in itself. However, we do see the value in looking outside of the city. So although we haven't mapped, we have done some preliminary research with field researchers looking particularly into the smaller coastal towns, also because of permanent poaching and the relationship with that also, and sort of trading with triads for drugs and that kind of thing. And so we see less violence. We haven't looked at it that in depth, but on like a brief look at it when we've considered doing a paper on sort of the impact of gangs in smaller towns. There is less violence, and we would probably assume, like it was suggested, that it's because there's less competition. There's usually only one or two of the more established gangs that have the ability to kind of take over that presence. One thing we did notice, one of the coastal towns, I think it's Fisherhaven, maybe, on the way to Hermanus in Cape Town, that one of the smaller gangs, interestingly, from a more gang-contested area in Cape Town, saw the economic opportunity that there wasn't a very big market in that area, and then moved there and started kind of to take over that area. And then the big gang that they left from in the city was like, oh, new market, and then they went and took over instead, and then it became more violent. So I do think that it's also valuable, like you suggested, to look at it now, because I think it is going to change over time. Then there was a question on our methodology and how we define the different people. For gang members, it's people that self-identify as gang members. And we wouldn't label someone necessarily individually as a gang member unless they're self-identified as such. That's quite common. People take pride in being a part of a gang. That's evident in their tattoos and in the sort of sense of community that comes with being in a gang. So it's not, it's quite common that someone will easily self-identify and not have a problem with doing that in our interviews. When you say who do we identify, the citizens, the victims, the gang members, I don't think it's that simple again. I think...
No, I wasn't saying that. I was just saying it's difficult for me, let's say if I'm in Cape Town, to say who is a gangster, who is a citizen, who is a patient.
I think...
And all those things. I mean,
right.
how do you... maybe I'll speak to you afterwards, but
okay,
I think it's difficult to work with thing on Cape Town in the public sector.
Right. And yeah, we can chat a bit more about it, but I think there is so much overlap, and that relates to another question. But just that there is a lot of overlapping in terms of who would just, victims and those that are sort of associated or happy to have the gangs there because they provide services, so are they kind of part of the gang, and how we try and understand that can often be quite complex. There was a question about what role does incarceration play in gang culture? That's a massive question, and I would be happy to talk a bit more about that afterwards. My short answer would be negative effect. So the prison gangs, which obviously I think you're aware of how they work, the number gangs have a very strong mythology and ideology and structure and hierarchy, and so the street gangs, although they have some of that, it's nowhere near to the same degree. And so people, when you enter prison, generally for safety, you will join one of the number gangs. And so I think it becomes a lot more sort of ingrained in an individual identity of being involved in a gang. And so when you come out, I think it maybe is potentially more part of who people are than before they went in. We are noticing quite a lot of change in dynamics between the prison gangs and the street gangs, because they used to actually be, these gangs are the ones that operate on the street, these are the ones that operate in prison. They have relationships, but they're quite exclusive. That's changing, and we're noticing more and more how prison gangs, particularly in Cape Town, I would say the second biggest gang in terms of turf and influence is now actually the 28s, which is a prison gang, because we were noticing how when they came out of prison, their equal position, or the positioning that they would get in a street gang, wouldn't be equal to the status they had in prison. And so they weren't getting as much economic sort of value for the kind of the badge that they had earned. And so they weren't happy with that, and realized that actually their number of members is actually much bigger, because so many people that are involved in street gangs are actually also have a number from when they were incarcerated. And so now they have their own independent presence on the street. I'm happy to talk more about that later if you want. The question on mapping and in upmarket places. So gangs don't stick to just certain neighborhoods, and so whether or not we mapped a neighborhood was whether or not it was identified that a gang had some kind of strong controlling presence and criminal market of sorts, right? So it is going to be different in, for example, say Hanover Park to Sea Point, but that's more the difference in the levels of violence that can be used, although we are seeing more and more sort of violence in upmarket places, but there's a strong drug market in a lot of these places, and so in Sea Point, for example, there are a few gangs that operate there, and they also run extortion of local nightclubs, restaurants, bars, and so they have quite a strong presence. That doesn't mean that they have physically taken turf of every sort of residential block, but in that neighborhood they have got a presence. Then the last question on what generates different responses from the community, I think that's really complex, and we can chat about that for quite some time. And again, like I said earlier, I think the overlap on these relationships is very common. And so on one hand, someone will be against the gangs for the impact that they're having, but also reliant on them for other things. And so they kind of also, as the gangs are very flexible and fluid, and they fragment and they change their relationships and their alliances, I think it's the same for community members and residents as that, the impact that they're having and things like that. I think that's it.
Thank you for all the questions. I'm going to try to go through it in some sort of logical order. So I want to start with the question of taking a more of a Marxist approach and paying attention to sort of economic systems. I mean, that's definitely there. I didn't really go into it in the sense that for my dissertation, I'm trying to sort of also think about what are the particular forms of gangs that evolve out of very different economic and social orders. So you have the Trustus with the colony, you have very specific types of street gangs in the sort of industrialization period, District 6. You have very sort of different street gangs now, you know, in neoliberalism, as you already suggested. But at the same time, I think there's a huge limit to that. Don Pinnock has done the work. You know, he's looked at you know, gangs in relation to deindustrialization. You know, the sort of you know, the economic experiences of different communities and dislocation, the forced relocations. Stephen Jensen has done some of the work in terms of the migration of rural communities into Cape Town, who were looking for jobs, and how that informed or that influenced different gang trends. But I think, like, you know, that was sort of my initial approach, and I quickly switched because I think race actually plays a huge role, racialization and the history of racialization. And that's what I'm gravitating towards, and that's what I want to focus on. Not because class, and I mean class is hugely important, obviously, as I was clearly trying to talk about between Ham and Sturgeon and that sort of discourses. But I think taking a Marxist approach has created a very limited literature on gangs. You know, I think like Pinnock's work is very fundamental, but it only went as far back as industrialization. You know, gangs go back, or at least the sort of, you know, the sort of roots of gangs go way back to the moment of the Cape Colony when racialization started happening. And I think there's something important there to really go into. So it's not to say that a Marxist analysis is not important. I am engaging with that, but I think I think that's very limited. You know, to be frank. I also think it relates to this other question, why the focus on colored communities. You know, again, I think there's something very specific about the way in which the you know, colored identity, the processes of racialization, which go hand in hand with processes of creolization, as Erasmus talks about, and that were very specific with the colored community, because racialization involved a very specific way of criminalization, right? A criminalizing of lifestyles, right? Criminalizing of Khoi lifestyles. When the Caledon Code was passed, and that was the first passed laws, right? So, you know, there's a very particular history of criminalization that went from the Cape Colony, and now you have a very particular hyper-incarceration in colored communities. So I think there's, you know, it's not to say that gangs are a colored phenomenon. Again, that's not the case. But I think there's something unique going on there that we need to unpack, right? So the question, I mean, a lot of work is done around creolization in colored communities, vis-a-vis language, food, the history of food, culinary practices, religion, and I can go on. But the one question is, what has been the role of gangs in these processes of creolization? And that's what I'm trying to explore, you know, and that's why I think it is important to think about this. And again, it goes back to my initial sort of broader question of, like, this phenomenon of gangs is happening in places where you have creolization, very specific forms of creolization happening around the world, right? With the Philippines, right? With Brazil, right? With Central America, with the U.S., right? Where creolization into linguistic, cultural, religious, etc. So I think that's why my study is focused on colored communities and that history, right? It's not to say that research shouldn't be done on the evolving and the sort of more recent evolution of gangs in the townships. That's definitely happening, and that needs to be researched. But I think there's something here that has been missing in the literature that I'm trying to tackle. There was a question about how do we start thinking about the community as the problem. I find that a bit problematic, just sort of feeding off of Kelly Gillespie from UWC, who's talking about how from 1994 in the neoliberal era, that has been the approach. It's been central to the discourse around colored communities need to reform themselves. That's how gangs are gonna, and that's been the logic of incarceration. That's been the logic in the past 25 years. To think about the community as the problem, I mean, that goes really deeply into, again, the racialization of coloredness and colored identity as supposedly having moral shortcomings, cultural shortcomings. There's always a problem with the community. No, there's a history, a violent history that has led to this, but at the same, going to the other question about is my project legitimizing gangs? I hope not. At least not legitimizing the violence of gangs. Okay. This is not necessarily something I write about, but it's my own thinking. I mean, what's really wrong with a gang? I mean, we're like a lot of us. We have our brotherhoods, we have our groups, we have our crews. And we don't call them gangs because gangs has a very particular stigma. But I don't know. That to me is it's a social formation. It's a bond, right? So I think in the sort of essence of these groups of men and to some extent women as well. I think that's something that's also been underexplored. I think there isn't necessarily something wrong with gangs as a social unit and as a social formation. There's lots wrong with the violence and especially gender-based violence and a lot of issues that needs to be unpacked. But even if you go into that, I mean, there's a lot that needs to be done from the state side. A lot of education that is not done. A lot of issues around patriarchy in this country, that needs to be unpacked, right? So, to sort of think about gangs as simply negative, I think is also missing the point. So I'm not trying to legitimize gang violence, but I am trying to engage with gangs in I think a little bit more of a nuanced way. Okay, so going to the question of what is the role of religion in the workshops, how do I engage with religion to unpack the history? We definitely talk about the history of Islam in South Africa because that's a huge part of the history of just the colored identity. I mean the culinary practices. I mean Habiba Baladoon goes into this a lot. But I'm definitely I guess one issue is that there's a tendency for programming in prisons and sort of with men in gangs that is always very religious in a very specific way. So I'm also kind of weary of how I engage with religion. I mean, I talk about the history of it, that comes in there. We engage with that, as you saw with the Sons of Ham. That is a biblical narrative, so we critique that as well. We engage with these things. It's poetry, and for me, poetry has always been something spiritual, right? It's something that engages with myth, taking mythologies that are a lot of times from the Bible and such things, and reinventing them in poetic ways. So we definitely engage with these things, but I'm also wary of sort of falling into this tendency to see men as morally, having a moral void that needs to be, that men need to be saved and such things, that's not my part of the work. Not to say that, for men who are saved and find meaning in that, that's not legitimate, of course that's valid, but it's not a focus of my project. But it relates to the other question around kham and kham, right? And I think there was a recent thing in Facebook that's been circulating that's like one of those memes that says, that has a picture of a lion, and it says, kham comes from kham, and kham as one of the Khoi languages, lion, right? And I don't know how much that's true, like in terms of the actual etymology of the word kham, but I think it's a beautiful reclamation of the word, right? I think it's really powerful, I think it's dope. I think things like that I do engage with in the workshops, like this is the actual history, as a historian has argued at least, I don't know. But there's this other sort of meaning that people are sort of attaching to kham, and that's cool, and we can engage with that because that's what we do, right? With language, we give new meanings to it, and that's what we do in poetry. So that kind of relates to the question of religion in the sense that I think there are like these sort of also like mythology and sort of terms from Khoi mythology that become very interesting in these workshops, and such things like that. Okay. And the question of the categorization of gangsters. Wait, I'm not sure if I understand the question now, because I was going to say the same thing. Like it's like how do you identify? But I think there's also something that I've definitely been picking up in terms of gangsters. There is as Kim said, there is a pride for many. But even for ex-gangsters, there's I think something more important. There's a stigma, right? There's a very particular stigma that gangsters share. Right, a very particular experience of the kind of stigmatizing experiences they have in the CBD, in different parts of Cape Town. Like I said, in relation to communities that are more middle class, even colored communities, or even family members that are middle class. Right, it's a particular stigma, and I think that kind of feeds into like when you say the categorization of gangsters. It's definitely self-identifying, but it's also self-identifying. I think, it's like society has identified them as gangsters. You see, there's been a very sort of complex experience of stigmatizing that sort of comes into the space. So again, I'm not sure if I'm getting the question, but we can definitely talk a lot more after this. And I think the last question is, what is the role of prisons? The only thing I want to say to that is, again, sort of going back to my earlier point around the history of racialization. I think the prison has played a very particular role in how governing and controlling elites have tried to control the colored community, right? Going back to the Breakwater prison, which is the V&A now, or based near the V&A, the waterfront in Cape Town, a very rich area. There was the Breakwater prison, which is now the GSB, the Graduate School of Physics, the UCT GSB, used to be a prison. And that prison has a very interesting history, right, in terms of the incarceration of Khoi activists back in the early or late 1800s. Robben Island was also first used to sort of also with the convicts who were brought from Southeast Asia, also at Robben Island, rebellion leaders or suspected rebellion leaders, also during the colony, also Robben Island. So I think the prisons has always played a very particular role. But I think it's very interesting to see the sort of gravitation of the numbers mythology into the prisons on the Western Cape, in the sense that, you know, again, like the kind of metaphor that I'm trying to play with in my research is, you know, the Trustus went to the mountains and evaded the colonial gaze, right? Created these, lived in a sort of space where the colonial gaze could not penetrate. And today you have prison gangs that have sort of reclaimed that prison and created very complex structures, very, you know, ritualistic behaviors, deep complex linguistic structures, and such things which I think, you know, get to the same point of opacity, of creating these complex structures that even the prison officials can't penetrate, right? Nobody can really penetrate. There are researchers like Johnny Steinberg who have gone in and taken narratives, but there's a level of like deep meaning that I think, you know, the sort of prison gangs have created this complex structure around. So I think the role of prisons is a very interesting thing, but for me, more so in relation to the history of racialization, and the history of creolization in the colored community. Thank you.
Whoa. The NZ is rats issue, like the gangster rap in 19s, Tupac and Notorious Big. But the colloquium be continued tomorrow here, 9 o'clock, yes? See you.